Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to look at climate, the first lesson in climate. And climate is not exactly weather. It's more of an average weather over a long period of time in more of a region or a larger area. So is over the average of a year or 10 years, is that area dry? Does it receive a lot of rain or a little bit of rain? Is it generally warm? Is it generally cool? Does it go from extremes to very hot to very cold? That would be the area or the area of climate that someone would study. Now, climate can change over an area as the winds change, as the temperature changes, as the components of the air changes, and there are people that's all they study is how the climate is changing within the year, within the time, and also within an area. So let's look at. So climate is different from weather. Weather is whatever the precipitation, heat, and wind, humidity of a certain area is at a specific time. So in this town, or even on this street, or on this side of a hill, at this place at this time, certain events are happening, and that's called weather. And weather is usually different everywhere, depending upon what's going on at the place. Heat-wise, humidity-wise, what's going on with the air pressure, and all kinds of different factors that determine whether it's raining or snowing or whatever. Climate is more long-term. So this is over a long period of time in a general area. That's the climate. So you usually think of climate as being a broader region perhaps, rather than a very specific. You could have a microclimate on one side of a tree with a microhabitat of only certain things that would grow there. But generally, climate's thought of as broad and over a long period of time. So you think of it as averages-ish. So this picture is awesome. This is annual variations of average temperature. So you can see that around the tropics, that's getting most of the sunlight. The sun is lined up nearly, the Earth is on the sun's equator, and the sun is on the Earth's equator. Now the Earth is tilted 23.5 degrees. So sometimes the sun is above the equator. Okay, so its highest extent in the northern hemisphere summer would be 23.5 degrees north of the equator, and then on our coldest day or our longest day, the winter, it would be 23.5 degrees south of the equator, but it doesn't matter. Over the entire year, it averages to where the highest temperatures are along the tropic lines. Then the coldest temperatures would be along the poles. So it's in incremental stages between, in this case, red and blue, hot and cold. Now, there's, when I said averages before, there are lots of places where the weather is actually measured. So mostly at airports, you're going to have the weather. We've talked about weather before. So the airspeed and the relative humidity and the temperatures and all of the things that are recorded, often most of the time at airports, you're going to have recorded over a long period of time. And so you can say, in Minneapolis, over the last 30 years, Minneapolis has an average temperature of, okay, or an average January temperature of, or July temperature of. So that can be thought of as kind of a baseline. That's normal over that period of time at that location. So for instance, New York City may be hotter than LaGuardia Airport, but because it's, lots of concrete and everything, it's not in the suburbs, it's right in the middle of the city, so there might be differences, but generically or generally, you can kind of estimate that over a long period of time, there's some normal that you can do. So even though that there's normals thought of as, is this strange or not for this to occur in January or June, there are some limitations because this is average for a place. Not whether or not something can be cold or hot. It's very possible. Now, climate can be affected by lots of different things. If you're close to a body of water, then that water can affect the humidity and, of course, can affect your climate. If you're not near a body of water, that remoteness to water can cause problems with the amount of rain you're going to get. It depends on how high you are away from the equator as to what the temperature is going to be. That affects your climate. Also, how high you are in the mountains. So because in the atmosphere, as you go higher in the atmosphere near the ground, it's going to get colder and colder. So if you're higher in the mountains, you're going to have a cooler temperature than if you're at the beach. So if you are at the beach, you can tend to have warmer temperatures, and because of warmer temperatures, it holds more water. So the higher you are in the mountains, you might have a drier climate. It depends. Also, you can have even where you are on a mountain. Are you on the front side of the mountain where the wind's blowing to you, or are you on the back side of the mountain where the mountain is protecting you from the wind and the weather, etc.? Now, this is a cool picture of why the tropics are hotter than the poles, because the tropics generally are taking parallel sun, like straight sunlight, more intense. As you're going towards the sides of the Earth, so the temperate zones, so North America, for instance, United States, the lines are not so intense, and so it's covering a broader area, and it's not so hot. And you end up with, a lot of times, 4 distinct seasons. When the angles get really, really small, like less than 30 degrees, then that light intensity is covering a huge area, and so it tuckers out its energy. Okay, so there's not enough energy to heat that area, and it becomes colder. So I was just mentioning that the tropics are up to 23. Those are called the tropic lines, Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. And the sun's direct rays are either over the equator, over the tropics, and it just kind of moves back and forth between the high tropic to the low tropic, crossing the equator as it goes. And so generally that's the hottest. Then the temperate zones are in between the poles, or in between the Arctic Circle and the tropic lines, and that would be usually 4 seasons. Then the tropics would be, low angles, 0 to 23 north and south. Now the water has a lot to do with it. So, for instance, this is a picture of Britain. You have Ireland there on the left. You have England and Scotland on the right, and this is an island, or 2 islands. And so, not only do you have an island, you have the Atlantic Ocean, which has currents in it, and the currents can keep that land warmer than normal. So even though it's very far north, it has a more temperate climate than other lands that far north. Also, where in England you are will determine what your climate is and what you could grow there. So certain places in England can grow certain crops and others cannot, based upon not necessarily how close to the poles they are, but really the warm air coming in from the ocean and the water coming in from the currents coming in from the ocean can affect the climate of that area. And then the last thing is even a mountain can have different climates on one side. So if you are on the windward side of a mountain where the wind is blowing into it, it's going to bring weather with it, and you might get rain on one side of a mountain. And then if the mountain is high enough, you've actually drained those clouds on one side, and then the other side of the mountain might be dry. So you might have a desert on one side of a mountain and a lush rainforest on the other. Very, very possible. And that's what climate is. Climate is not weather necessarily. It's weather over a region for various reasons. Now the last picture I have here is these air masses. If you have an air mass, so think of it not just as a wind, but like a huge blanket of air covering a large space. If that air is over a continent, it's not going to have a lot of water in it. It's going to be relatively dry. If it's over an ocean, it's going to be relatively humid or moist. If it's in far north next to the poles, it's going to usually be cold. If it's in the south towards the equator, it's going to generally be warm. So you can have warm dry, you can have warm and wet, you can have cold and dry, cold and wet. You can have all different kinds of air masses that settle over an area, and these air masses that tend to be in an area tend to affect its climate.